czasu masz mieszkanie w chmurach i błękicie, a ja na głowie mnóstwo spraw i na to wszystko jedno życie. A skoro wszystko lepiej wiesz, bo patrzysz na nas z lotu ptaka, to powiedz, czemu tak mi jest, że czasem tylko siąść i płakać.
But it is. So this is our first first in a series of possibly 3, but definitely 2 speakers. And what I'd like to do right now is to thank Oksana from the Warren Public Library and certainly the City of Warren for hosting us. And they've been so gracious and so helpful that actually brought all of you here tonight with their advertising and our advertising. So we thank you very much for coming, and we hope that you'll stay in touch with us during our 20th anniversary for some of our activities we're going to do, and for our next lecture series, which is May 18th. And it's at another library. She's going to talk about it later. But so thank you to the library, definitely. We are fortunate this evening to have several of our board members here, and I'd like to introduce them to you. Of course, Stella, who was disruptive in the back of the room, over that way, and Sasha Wadek here, if you'd like to stand or wave or whatever. So we're very fortunate that both of them are here. We have a national board, so we don't have a lot of board members that are local, so we appreciate our local board members because they take an active role, as our national directors can't do that. So thank you. I'd like to introduce very quickly the staff of the Piast Institute, which if you spend any time with us or you're at the Institute, you're amazed by the work that's accomplished there and the people that do that work. So I'd like to just recognize them. If Laura will stand. Laura Gerber.
You all met me already.
And Laura is the director of Hamtramck Drug-Free Community Coalition. That's part of the Piast Institute. Is a program of. And Shannon Schaefer. Shannon is, she's back there. You probably all talked to her. She is the director of our C3 program, a federal program that we have for substance use disorder that we do in the community. Robin Coyle, Robin's responsible for having all the food here today and organizing everything, and Robin Coyle is our financial director. We also have Frankie in the back. Wave, hey. Frankie's our high school intern that we absolutely can't live without. He works by us every afternoon right after school, and he's been with us for a year and a half. So we're really proud to have him on staff. And Michelle Trevino, yes, that is Paula Trevino's sister. So Michelle is our communication specialist working for us, and we're really happy to have her. I'd also like to introduce Magosha Tulepi.
I'm so glad everyone's here. Hello.
And she's the executive director, and she's been with us since she's been 15. So we try to get them young. We try to get them young and people. And in Fran's case, we can get her young. But
Thanks.
that's okay. And I am Virginia Skinnars. I'm the CEO. I have to think about that for a minute. Of the Piast Institute, and the co-founder, together with Dr. Thaddeus Brejolowski. So we co-founded the Institute together 20 years ago, And I don't think we would have anticipated that we really would have been here 20 years. So we wish Dr. could be with us, but he is every day. We work with his spirit, and his spirit's always with us. So we're very, very dedicated to the work that he started. So it means a lot to us to have him with us. And this is Fran Foote, but she's also the sister of Dr. Thaddeus Rachilowski. So Fran's been with us a number of years. She's our grant specialist, and these days she'd like to leave us because of the number of grants that we have at the Institute, and we're very proud of that. When we started 20 years ago, our first grant was for $5,000. Today we have an annual amount of our grants is $643,000. So we've grown, and we're proud of that. So we'd like everyone to know because of the work that we do. And if you want to learn more about us, please always come visit us because we welcome everyone. So Fran is going to introduce our guest speaker.
Go anywhere. You just need to give me a little space.
So thank you again for everyone coming, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
Good evening. It's my privilege to do this introduction. Imogene Salva is a first-generation American-born Pole. She grew up in Jackson Heights, Queens, New York, and traveled yearly to Poland throughout her childhood. She studied in France and holds an MA in linguistics. She's taught Spanish, Polish, French, K-12 in New York and Colorado. She presently lives in Westminster, Colorado with her husband, Brian. As an adult, Imogene realized that her mother's wartime story was shared by thousands, but known to only a few. The book by Imogene, entitled One Star Away, was published in 2020 and tells the story of her mother, Zuta, who as a child was deported from Poland with her parents and siblings to the communist authorities of the Soviet Union and placed in a forced labor camp in the Arctic areas of Russian Siberia during World War II.
Excuse me, but is that microphone on? I'm wondering if the people in back
Can people in the back hear me?
Yeah.
I have a pretty good voice most days, but thank you for checking. It followed Zuta's journey from Siberia to Iran and eventually to the United States. When I first spoke to Imogene by phone almost a year ago, it was clear that her passion for this story came through very clearly. As you hear Zuta's story tonight, many of you may see parallels to your own family history. Ms. Salva is happy to have this opportunity to share her mother's story with each and every one of you tonight.
Thank you very much, the Piazza Institute and Virginia, for the honor of being here. I just learned that I thought I was going to talk 2 hours or be here 2 hours, so I'm from New York, so I talk fast anyway, but I'm going to try to speed it up so I have a little film, a short documentary film that's going to accompany this talk. So tonight I'll be sharing with you all the story of one heroic Polish women's World War II odyssey. It's a subject that is not talked about in the media or in history books. It, however, was daily conversation in my life growing up because that brave woman was my dear mother, Zuta. Deported in the first wave of 4 massive deportations to a Soviet camp near Vologda, it never ceased to amaze me that my mother never considered herself a prisoner nor a survivor. But when she was only 10 years old, she was separated from her family and transported thousands of miles to India, not even knowing if ever they would be reunited. Yet, my mother considered herself a thriver. February 10th is a date that haunts me every year, for it is the anniversary of my mother and her entire family's deportation by the Bolsheviks to the northern reaches of Soviet Russia. One can imagine Gulag survivors to be lifeless shadows, people depressed, dejected. I often wondered how my mother, having endured such cruelty and loss, was so resilient. She was the embodiment of energy and vitality. Being Judith's daughter, I realized that there is no situation, no matter how desperate and hopeless, that we cannot survive. I hope to impart by the end of today's presentation how my mother transformed pain, loss, separation, and trauma into empowerment, and how she became, and we can all become, thrivers. That's my mom. I'm like 65. I happen to be wearing today this kurta, traditional dress from the state of Gujarat, India, which is located in the western corner here, bordering today's Pakistan. The last time I had worn it was in late September, early October of 2018, when my mother and I were leaving India after a 10-day blissful stay in honor of the 100 years of Poland celebrating regaining her independence. A few weeks earlier, I had found out that a reunion of former Polish orphan children who had been invited and adopted by an Indian Maharaja during World War II was going to take place at the same time of this centenary. These children, now in their late 80s and 90s, had kept in touch throughout the years despite living continents apart. Nothing could deter my mom from returning to her second homeland and seeing some of her former classmates. For my mom, it would be her first trip back to India in 72 years. A voyage back in time to a place she and her former Polish colleagues called the Good Land. It would also be a return to the family of the good Maharaja, who had adopted her and hundreds of orphaned and half-orphaned children for fear that the Bolsheviks would repatriate them back to Soviet Russia from where they had escaped. The Maharaja's children, now also in their 80s, greeted with tender warmth the former Balachali Polish residents, whom they fondly referred to as their brothers and sisters. The next 3 days were an experience of rekindled love and brotherhood. And just to let you know, my mom's in white. I think she was a nurse, and there's a theme in the book about white, but she's always in white. Sleeping memories came back to life, as did dances and songs. Lectures with local students were held, and this was in Jamnagar, in the capital of the state of Gujarat. For me and my family, we had no idea that this would be the last week of my mother's life. For 3 days after returning back to America, my mother went to sleep, and the next morning she never woke up. My mother always said she wanted to leave this world with a bang. We believe God took her that night, her life having come full circle. I am frequently asked by Americans, so how did your mother end up with another 120,000 people in Iran? And I should say Polish exiles in Iran. And how did India become for her and another 5,500 Poles, especially Polish children, their second homeland? And what links your mother to Joseph Stalin, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, featured here, and Maharaja Jamsaheb Digvijay Singhji, the Maharaja of Navanagar, India? To understand my mother's story, we need to go back in time to the end of the First World War, when Poland regained her independence after being erased from the map for 123 years. In 3 separate partitions perpetrated by Russia, Prussia, and Austria in the latter half of the 18th century, Poland had ceased to exist. So in 1918, the newly reborn republic was just getting back on her feet. Almost immediately, the Russian Bolsheviks sought to extinguish the reborn country, her faith, language, and culture. The Bolsheviks hoped to spread the communist revolution to Western Europe and marched into Poland, and by August of 1920, they were on the outskirts of Warsaw. On the left, we see that's Vladimir Lenin. Over here, he's rallying a crowd, right, of the Red Army, right before they're going to march into Poland. The young nation came together, mobilized its forces, and against all odds, and against all odds, the Poles won the Battle of Warsaw and halted the Soviet advance, thus saving Europe. After this defeat, Russian leader Vladimir Lenin, he was forced to surrender to Poland a large amount of territory, what Poles call the Eastern Borderlands, or in Polish Kresy. It was in these Eastern Borderlands that my mother Zhuta, as she liked to be called, her name was Józefa, was born in the province of Wołyń, in the red over here featured. It was an area the Red Army would return to claim 19 years later. On August 27, 1939, Stalin gave Hitler the green light to start World War II when the two allies signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on August 27, 1939. Poland was partitioned. You can see this is, at the time, Poland, between World War I and II, was partitioned along the Bug River, right there. Having divided Poland between themselves, both totalitarian regimes sought to enslave and subordinate its people. And for Poles, we call this the fourth partition. German troops invaded Poland on September 1st, triggering World War II. Poles fought valiantly against the superior German war machine, which had 3,600 armored vehicles against Poland's 750, and twice as many airplanes. Despite British and French signed military agreements, which they ensured Poland that they would come to our defense and launch an offensive against the Germans, no help arrived. What began in Poland was the extermination of ethnic Poles, including but not limited to the intelligentsia, clergy, and anyone who protested the Germans. By the end of the war, approximately 2.7 million ethnic Poles, just ethnic Poles, not Jewish or Lithuanians, ethnic Poles were murdered.
Are you going to mention Katyn?
Yes.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And another 2.5 million Poles were taken from their country against their will and brought to Germany as slave laborers. In accordance with the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the Soviets, they waited 16 days and invaded Poland from the east on September 17th. The Soviets' essential feature was terror. One example of that was the extermination of the elite. One of the most infinite examples of that was the Katyn massacre, in which the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, executed 22,000 Polish military officers and intelligentsia in April and May of 1940. Declassified documents in 2013 prove that the United States and Great Britain helped to cover up the massacre. To the present moment, no government has ever publicly charged the Soviet Union with responsibility for the massacre, nor has anyone been prosecuted for the crime. In December of '39, the Soviet government took the definitive decision to remove politically unreliable elements from occupied territories, the Kresy, the Eastern Borderlands. Representatives of the professional classes and of social groups considered hostile to the process of Sovietization. As a result, large-scale deportations of Polish people deep into the USSR took place between February of 1940 and June of 1941. As a rule, entire families were arrested and rounded up in the middle of the night by the NKVD and deported to forced labor camps all along the vast territory of the USSR in the hellish Gulag archipelago. The red dots that you see here represent the camps that made up the Soviet concentration camp system at the time. This was part of the Soviets' ethnic cleansing program. At 3:30 a.m. on February 10th, 1940, my mother and her entire family were awakened by a loud banging on the doors and windows of their home. A dozen Soviet soldiers broke in. This was commonplace. What happened to the Novitsky family happened to hundreds of thousands of Polish families at night and during 3 subsequent mass deportations. Some families were given no time to pack anything. My family was one of the lucky ones. They got about half an hour to pack their essentials. They were herded onto sleighs, which took them to a train station, upon which they were crowded into ice-cold cattle cars packed with 60 people. My mother's entire family's only crime was that they were Polish. The central features of these boxcars were bunks set aside for the lucky ones who could secure such a luxury, wooden floors, a small rectangular window that I don't think is represented, but it would have been on the side here, small rectangular windows, and an iron stove in the middle of the car, and a hole in the floor for a toilet with no privacy. The Soviet soldiers sarcastically would tell their Polish prisoners that they were traveling to paradise. In the winter, the uninhabitable wastelands of the Russian taiga resembled a white hell. Snow covered the ground for the majority of the months of the year. Anyone 14 years of age and older was forced to work 12 to 14 hours of this shift, they called it, in sub-zero temperatures, usually felling trees with primitive hand tools. In winter, the temperature would reach 50 below zero. By sending Poles to these camps, the Soviets effectively sentenced them to a slow death from hard labor in the bitter cold, with disease and exhaustion common. When workers died, the Soviets quickly replaced them with new shipments of hard laborers. In the summer, the heat was sweltering. Armies of mosquitoes swarmed everywhere. Prisoners were worked to death all the time, starving bellies, biting bed bugs, sickness and disease everywhere made life unbearable. My mother and aunts recall how in the summertime the Russians would tie their prisoners too weak to work to a wooden cross and leave them exposed to the elements and the mosquitoes to finish them off. Cruelty in the Gulag knew no religion, age, or gender. Gender equality in Soviet Russia meant that women were subjected to the same hard labor as men and had the double job of caring for their sickly children. Poor sanitary conditions, lack of nutrition, non-existent basic necessities were all things mothers had to face and make do. As a result, many newborns and infants perished early on, and the lack of food caused many children to be physically and mentally underdeveloped for life. All children from the age of 2 to 14 were subjected to compulsory Bolshevik education, or rather indoctrination. My mother was very lucky because at only 8 years of age, she didn't have to freeze in the frozen taiga and labor as her elder siblings did. In first grade, she had a strict Bolshevik teacher, Tovarish Alexandra, who quickly took a liking to my mother, and vice versa. Tovarish Alexandra would bring my mother blini, or blintzes. My mother soon learned that not all Russians were bad. I continue to give thanks to God daily for Pani Alexandra, who saved my mother's life from sure starvation. Daily rations consisted of one slice of a hard, clay-like bread, and this is how they looked. Well, there was a remarkable reversal of fortune on June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. The Red Army was in a state of chaotic retreat, and Hitler's forces seemed unstoppable. This was compounded by the fact that Stalin had killed off his best military officers in the pre-war Great Purge. What ensued was nothing short of a miracle for Poles imprisoned all over the USSR. Under pressure from British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Władysław Sikorski, the Prime Minister of the Polish government in exile in London. Stalin was compelled to reluctantly free the Polish exiles by declaring a so-called amnesty, and to allow for the creation of a Polish army on Russian soil to help fight the Germans. This agreement is known as the Sikorski-Maisky Agreement. The Soviets freed Polish General Władysław Anders to lead this Polish army. Until that moment, Anders had been held in the notorious Lubyanka Moscow prison, where he had been routinely tortured. General Anders knew Stalin's greedy intentions for Poland. The Sikorski-Maisky Agreement provided an opportunity to free hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens from labor camps and prisons, enabled the establishment of the Polish armed forces in the USSR, and strengthened the anti-Hitler coalition. Polish recruitment centers were set up in some camps, in some of the Gulag camps. However, some administrators of Soviet camps interfered with the authorized release of their Polish inmates. For them, meeting their monthly quota was more important. In many cases, people had to escape their camps, and that was the case of my family, which is recorded in the book. From August of 1941 to March of 1942, the Polish Armed Forces, or more commonly known as the Anders Army, was formed. It attracted not only soldiers who had been kept in the Soviet camps, but also thousands of civilians, and even the orphans whose parents had perished in the Gulag. The main obstacle was getting to these army centers, which were located thousands of miles in some cases from the prison camps. But Poles would not be deterred. Thousands died along the way to the centers, mostly due to starvation, dysentery that decimated men, women, and children. The lucky ones who made it to these centers arrived starved, lice-infested, and diseased. There is a saying in Polish that says, Polak potrafi, which can be best translated as we Poles can. Despite all adversities, a Polish army of approximately 80,000 men, women, and even children, as young as 14 years of age, was formed. General Anders formed a young soldiers' cadet school. Boys 14 to 18 years of age who enlisted were given military training. The older boys learned the use of small arms, and one of these young cadets was my uncle Tadeusz Nowicki. Here's General Anders with two young cadets. When the Soviets refused to provide the adequate food ration supplies and weapons for the growing Polish army, General Anders set about evacuating the army from the USSR to the Middle East. After the British-Soviet invasion of Iran in August of 1941, Stalin agreed in March of 1942 to evacuate part of the Polish formation as a military force to Iran, in which they would secure the safety of Allied supply lines to the USSR and secure oil fields. Eventually, all of the soldiers and civilians gathered were allowed to leave the Soviet Union and to enter British-controlled territories. Here we have the route taken by the Anders Army or the Polish forces out of the Soviet Union. From the southern Ural area of Buzłuk, Tolskoye, and Saratov, which is here, they traveled south to Central Asia, here, and then after that they traveled west to the country not at the time, it was under the Soviet Union, but to Turkmenistan, today's Turkmenistan. We see here Ashgabat and Krasnovodsk here.
What time was this? What year?
This was in 1942. It started after the Sikorski-Maisky Agreement, but basically the army was being relocated. They were predominantly by foot, by train in the Soviet Union. There were two routes that they took, and in late 1941 till May of 1942. This is around where I am now, in May of 1942. And one route, and here's the exodus, but it was an exodus, by the way, of biblical proportions.
How many?
80,000 military personnel along with 40,000 civilians. They were evacuated from the Soviet Union and crossed into Iran. One route was crossing the Caspian Sea on Soviet ships such as the Zhdanov. Ships were overloaded, but Poles were willing to risk everything to get out of what we call the inhuman land, nieludzka ziemia. Many in Andrew's army left Krasnovolsk in what is today's Turkmenistan to the Iranian port city of Pahlavi. Many Poles didn't survive this journey. Many fell overboard and drowned. Others had died from exhaustion. Another very risky expedition taken was from an orphanage in Ashgabat or Ashgabat, which is along the border here from Turkmenistan, over the Kopet Dag mountain range, which is here in red, to Mashhad. My mother and two of her siblings were evacuated through army lorries along this route. The bottom picture on this slide over here, that's a modern day picture, but it shows the road is paved, but it's still treacherous. The medical staff attending to the living Polish evacuees referred to them as ruins or walking skeletons. As you can see, there's no difference between these emaciated bodies of the Polish children featured here and the children who barely survived the German Holocaust. In Tehran, where a large contingent of Poles had arrived, there are several Polish cemeteries where more than 3,000 Poles lay. And those on the left, those are three sisters. This is a picture from the Piłsudski Institute in New York that I got permission to show. It's also in the book. An American took this picture, and nobody, again, they were so shocked, like, where are they escaping from, these people? They had no idea. Again, Stalin was Uncle Joe in the United States. We were allies. So nobody had even imagined that Poles were, and other ethnic groups were being taken to labor camps all over the USSR. In Tehran, where the young 20-year-old Shah of Iran had personally seen to it in 1942 that refugee camp number 3 would be located in the private gardens of his palace. My mother always recalled how the Persians were very welcoming to the Poles who had just escaped the inhuman land. The young Shah was fiercely anti-communist and worked incessantly to rid his country from threats of Soviet domination. It was an honor for my mother, almost 40 years later, to have been one of the nurses attending to the Shah of Iran in 1979 when he came for cancer treatment to New York Hospital in New York City. He was the only living individual in New York at the time who could personally testify to my mother's tragedy and rescue, and knew firsthand that the world powers had silenced her story. And I maybe didn't mention this before, but my mother was always seen as a conspiracy theorist, because up until this time in the United States, nobody really talked until maybe Gorbachev in the 90s, what the Poles had endured in Soviet Russia.
The reason why was in 1940, Russia ended up becoming an ally of the United States, and because of that, that was the reason why a lot of that was kept secret, I believe.
Yeah, and even in school, when I was in school and up until in grammar school, and I would raise my hand and I would try to speak, and because we were only taught about the Jewish Holocaust, and when I would tell about my mother's story, they would, you know what, put your hand down. They'd be like, next story.
And we didn't want to have to say anything about it. I think something should have been said, and it wasn't. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. I wanted to show, and I just hope I don't mess this up because I know we had technical difficulties before, a very short clip. This was a World War II media clip that was shown all over the free world. And let me see if I can make this big screen. So this is what Westerners, I don't know if this is it, but I'm hoping.
Here you go. You got it.
Oh no, this is not the one, believe it or not. I don't know how this came up, but I'm so sorry, one moment. Oh boy, let me just see if, okay. It's a short clip, but, let's see. sorry, one moment. They said they had it, let me see. Let me see if I could put in. Let me see if I can find the name, but in Iran. I'm sorry for all the noise. Fight for freedom. Let's see if it comes up. It was here and then must have disappeared. I think this is it. Let's hope that this is it. Okay. Okay, is the sound up? I don't know how. Remember we had that issue? They can't hear, can they?
Can everyone hear?
No. Okay, how do we had this, it wasn't even working before. How did they, do you know how they did this?
I'm not sure.
Because we had 3 or 4 different computers, nothing was working with the sound, and, yeah, not sure. So, but anyway, the bottom line is, I don't want to ruin it if we get to watch it, but,
You put the closed caption on.
pardon me?
If you put the closed caption on, you can put that on.
I was wondering if I could put the microphone, I don't know where it would be here, to, because this isn't my computer, it's like the 3rd or 4th one, I'm sorry. Let's see if they can get somebody, if not, I'll just,
The closed caption piece, can you hit that and see whether
That's the CC for closed caption. See
the little one in the bottom?
this? Click on it?
Yeah, please. There you go.
Oh, and then just now?
Now the words are
Oh,
gonna.
I'm so sorry. Okay.
That's worse.
Now, is this it right here? I was just helping her with all the instructions.
Oh, here she comes.
Wanderers upon the face of the earth.
That's okay.
Patriots from Poland, nearing the end of one of the most amazing marches in history. 3,000 weary miles they've walked to find a haven of refuge. Some have babies that were born during the pathetic 3-year flight from their homeland.
Okay, well, they can.
A people who since 1939 have known war as perhaps no other people have known it. A people who have known hunger, starvation. A people ground to helplessness beneath the heel of Nazi oppression. From one little town in Poland, 1,000 men, women, and children fled from the Nazis into Russia. When the Nazis followed, they pushed on, through mountain and desert, 3,000 miles to Persia, to a haven in Iran on the Caspian Sea. Here they found a promised land, a refugee city of their countrymen deep in the foothills of the Trans-Caucasian Mountains. From British and American Red Cross stations, they receive fresh clothing, shoes to replace those worn ragged beyond recognition or repair. The first real home-cooked meal in years. Quickly, schools are formed that Poland's speech may never die. Mothers till the ancient soil of Persia, while father, son, and daughter leave to join new armies of the Polish government in exile. Legions of Polish women and legions of Polish men now forming to join the United Nations in the fight against the Axis. The prayers of their countrymen go with them, prayers for their success and prayers for their safe return. Daily, little Poland in Persia grows as new arrivals swell their numbers.
Okay, I'm just going to
Reunion in
stop it
Iran
here, even though
finally
it's a little
started
bit
more than
longer.
3 years ago.
I know, maybe, I hope somebody could have
The
read the beginning,
courageous
but
people of
that was a
Poland
story Westerners
lives of the
and
United
Americans were
Nations
told
in the
during
fight
and
for
after
freedom.
World War II by pro-Soviet American and British news media. And in case you missed it, the news reported that the Poles arriving on foot to Iran from the Soviet Union had just escaped Nazi Germany. They were on a 3-year flight through Soviet Union from Germany, fleeing the Germans. And so, sadly, many people in the free world believe that propaganda, all the way up till when I was born, and that's what they believed. Nobody, so, I was seen as this strange conspiracy theorist, what are you talking about? So, let's see if I can get back down to the PowerPoint, let's see. Here, right, and then, let's see, big screen here. On this one. I'm sorry, I have a Mac, and it's like, oh, there you go, okay, up there, I see. Okay, so let's see, so I was here, all right, and here's just Polish schooling in Iran. The Persians there were so many cities, Isfahan and Tehran, where so many Poles were, as I said before, welcomed by the Persians, and there were some intermarried and stayed in Persia. And I have Polish family members that go back to the cemeteries, Dubai cemetery, and they, even during the Iranian crisis, and as Poles, they were always welcomed. This was one of the few photos that my mother has, and we have a little black and white, so I had to really work hard to get these bigger, but this was from the original, the second of 3 major expeditions to India from Iran. So most of the children who had arrived in Mashhad, Iran, they had plans for a further journey to India. Iran was only a stop in their adventure-filled journey. My mother, aunt, and one uncle, they were part of a second out of 3 major expeditions. This was the second one. This actually picture was taken somewhere in Afghanistan. His Highness Maharaja Jamsaheb Diviji Singhi ascended the throne of the princely state of Navanagar in 1933. He was elected the Chancellor of the Chamber of Indian Princes in 1942. It was in that capacity and with his influence money that he invited initially 500 Polish children, and as I said before, they were mostly orphan or half-orphaned, to his princely state of Navanagar. And Navanagar today is called Gujarat, the state of Gujarat. In Balachadi, on the Bay of Kutch, this was near his summer villa on the right-hand side, he established a children's camp for the Polish children. Many wondered why His Highness was so generous to the Polish children. What was the Polish connection? And to learn more about my mother's noble hero and rescuer, I'd like to share a very close friend of mine. We made a movie back in 2014 in India, in Gujarat, with some of the former survivors. And I don't know if I can, is this a good time that I could show part of it? Do we have help again?
It's your time, however you want to use it.
I don't know if, with the sound, let me see, do we have who was here before? Did she go? I don't know. I just don't want to ruin it. Let's see.
Is she in the?
Imogene, she's part of it already.
She left.
She left.
Okay, let's see if this works. I'll make a big screen.
On 1st of September 1939, German troops invaded Poland. This was the beginning of the Second World War. On 17th of September 1939, the remaining territory of Poland was attacked by the Soviet Union. The intention of aggressors was to permanently wipe out Poland from the world map. The occupying countries initiated repressions of Polish citizens. The official terror threatening armless civilians, genocide, imprisonments, forced labor, and resettlement of people from Poland to remote areas of Soviet Union. Only a few could survive transportation and the following life in extreme conditions. Subdued to slavery labor, they had no escape. Those lucky enough to get released had nowhere to return to. They had no homeland or homes and had mostly lost their families. There were, however, nations in the world that represented their large-heartedness and opened the gates of their households to give shelter to Poles during this worst of all wars. This film tells the story of an uncommon, noble, and generous act of goodwill by an Indian Maharaja of Navanagar, Jam Sahib Digvijay Singh Ji, who helped in saving the priceless values, life, childhood, and hope of almost 1,000 Polish kids.
Jestem na tej ziemi po raz czwarty i nie wiem, czy nie po raz ostatni, ale ta ziemia pozostanie zawsze w moim sercu.
(1939), a year etched in the memory of history and historians. While in the Indian subcontinent, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, revered as the father of the nation, took his first step to end an autocratic rule through a non-violent protest. There was violence at its worst, brewing across Europe. It was the beginning of World War II.
Dwa największe państwa Europy, nazistowska III Rzesza i stalinowski Związek Sowiecki, państwa pozornie odległe od siebie ogromnie ideologicznie, porozumiały się w jednej kwestii: konieczności zmiany porządku wersalskiego w Europie. 23 sierpnia 1939 roku w Moskwie podpisano tzw. pakt Ribbentrop-Mołotow, niemiecko-sowiecki układ o nieagresji, wraz z dołączonym do ściśle tajnym protokołem zapowiadającym rozbiór Polski. Do agresji nazistowskiej III Rzeszy na Polskę doszło 1 września 1939 roku. Do agresji stalinowskiego Związku Sowieckiego 17 września. W okresie od lutego 1940 roku do czerwca 1941 władze sowieckie przeprowadziły 4 wielkie deportacje ludności z ziem wschodnich Polski, wywożąc w głąb Związku Sowieckiego według źródeł sowieckich ponad 325 000, według źródeł polskich kilkakrotnie więcej obywateli naszego kraju.
Ja tam miałem jeszcze takie organki, które po drodze trzymałem jakoś w ręku, no i wchodzimy drapiemy się na ten samochód, no i tam już pełno tych ludzi, byliśmy przerażeni po prostu.
Dowiedziałam się, że tatuś nie żyje i od tego czasu już nigdy nie odmówiłam tej modlitwy, którą wierzyłam, że pomoże.
Miałem około 6 lat. Wobec tego mama zapytała, a gdzie on jest? Gdzie może być? Kierowniczka odpowiedziała, może na cmentarzu, sprawdź.
Ale udało mi się dyskretnie podejść pod okno, które było uchylone. Tyle, co ostatni raz widziałem matkę.
It was these difficult conditions that made General Sikorski the first Prime Minister of Polish government in exile and Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Armed Forces write to Sir Winston Churchill, the then Prime Minister of England, calling his attention for safeguarding the treasure of Poland, these starving young children, and take them into safer zones in healthy climatic countries of the world. One of the first to listen was India. The voices of these young innocent children was heard by Jam Sahab Digvijay Singhji, the Maharaja of Navanagar, an erstwhile princely state in the Kathiawar Peninsula, alongside the state of Gujarat in India, a country where history embedded with valor and tradition treat guests as God.
Proszę mi pozwolić używać określenia stosowanego w Polsce. Dobry Maharadża. Był kanclerzem Izby Książąt Indyjskich, ale był także członkiem brytyjskiego Imperial War Cabinet i to z racji tej funkcji dowiedział się o problemie wielu dziesiątków tysięcy polskich uchodźców, którzy opuścili Związek Sowiecki.
Deeply moved and distressed by the suffering of the Polish nation, and especially of those who are spending their childhood and youth in the tragic circumstances of this most terrible of wars, I wanted to contribute and in some way improve their lot by offering them refuge in a country that is far away from the ravages of war. I am extremely pleased that I have the opportunity to alleviate the suffering of these children as I sympathize with the Polish nation and its relentless struggle against oppression. A nation which has produced such magnificent sons. My father was very interested in the Polish situation. Now, when the Polish nation is fighting so heroically, when Polish soldiers take part in the battle on all fronts, when more than 1 million Poles have been dispersed throughout the world, I am trying to do whatever I can to save the children, as they must regain their health and strength after these dreadful trials, so that in the future they will be able to cope with the tasks that await them in a liberated Poland.
Polish children from war-torn homeland, refugee slaves of labor camps in Siberia, losing not only a sense of identity, but a home that they could call their own. Some, all of 10 years, carrying their siblings in different groups, traveled long and arduous journeys of thousands of miles from Russia through Iran, Afghanistan, and today's Pakistan to reach to their healing destination in India.
Siostra, brat i ja trafiliśmy do sierocińca w Aszchabadzie. Następnie z Aszchabadu z sierocińcem do Meszhedu. Po jednym postoju takim raptem młodszy brat zaginął gdzieś. Poszukiwanie, gdzie jest Czesiek, no i w końcu okazało się, że kierowca go przyprowadził.
Z rana dowiedziałyśmy się, że po południu będziemy przejeżdżać granicę persko-indyjską. Wyruszyliśmy z rana i nie mogłam doczekać się granicy. Nareszcie auta zatrzymały się przed łańcuchem. To była granica i po sprawdzeniu dokumentów pojechaliśmy dalej. Koło Delhi było bardzo dużo miast i nazbieraliśmy po ogromnych pudełkach cukierków. Zaczęliśmy się zbliżać do Bombaju. Wyładowali nas do aut i przez miasto powieźli do Bandry. Z daleka było czuć morze, a nasz dom leżał nad samym morzem, tylko trzeba było przejść przez ulicę, falochron i można było kąpać się. Mieszkaliśmy w willi otoczonej tak zwaną dżunglą, w której było pełno palm kokosowych i daktylowych.
Po pewnym czasie zorganizowano transport do Indii. Bardzo atrakcyjne dla mnie było to, że były alarmy i na brzegu już stał pociąg, wagony kolejowe wjeżdżały prawie do wody. Tyle pamiętam.
Po wagonach błyskawicznie rozniosła się wieść, że jesteśmy na miejscu. Wysiadamy w pośpiechu, gdyż kilkudniową podróż pociągiem nie byliśmy zachwyceni. Na dłuższe refleksje nie ma jednak czasu. Czeka nas jeszcze ostatni, 30-kilometrowy odcinek drogi. Cóż to znaczy wobec tych kilku tysięcy, jakie mamy za sobą? Niemniej wszyscy są bardzo ciekawi, więc w pośpiechu wsiadamy do podstawionych wojskowych samochodów. Obsługują je żołnierze indyjscy w mundurach marynarskich. Później zaprzyjaźnimy się z nimi bardzo serdecznie.
Jak ciężarówki zabierały dzieci z Aszchabadu w Turkmenistanie do Indii przez Persję, to mama Jadwigi myślała, że się zabierze razem, no ale musiała zostać i Jadwiga pojechała wobec tego sama.
To samo stało się z mamą Jerzego. Musiała zostać w Związku Radzieckim, a myśmy razem z Jerzym pojechali do Indii.
Balachari, 25 kilometers from Jamnagar, within the soulful state of Gujarat, where human compassion is customary since generations, Jam Sahib built a home for about 1,000 of these Polish children who lived here from 1942 to 1946.
A witając kolejne grupy tych dzieci mówił: nie uważajcie się już za sieroty. Jesteście teraz Nawanagarajczykami, a ja jestem Bapu, ojciec wszystkich mieszkańców Nawanagaru, w tym również i wasz.
I jestem tutaj znowuż, na tym wzgórzu, w Balaczadzi, na moim wzgórzu. Tu zaczynały się zabudowania kuchenne, tam były bloki nasze, mieszkalne. Tam w głębi widać zbiorniki wody. To były nasze płuca naszego osiedla. Bardzo ważna czynność, tam była woda.
Life was creating a very different breath of love for two young teenage survivors who had traveled difficult journeys alone to find a home under Bapu's protection in Balachadi.
Wszystko mi się spodobało, no bo była pierwszą dziewczyną, którą ja się w ogóle zainteresowałem. A kiedy jej powiedziałem, że się w niej zakochałem, to był dopiero 1995 rok. Ja już byłem w związku, a ona była w ten czas wolna i prawdopodobnie miała zamiar kogoś sobie znaleźć. No a ja jej nie miałem nic do oferowania. No a potem ona też się związała z kimś. W związku z tym to już zupełnie nie można było nic na ten temat mówić.
Ja tu nie czuję się gościem. Przyjeżdżam tu któryś raz, bo ten teren jest moją drugą ojczyzną był. Także traktuję się tu jako swój. Nie jako gość, ale jako swój na swoim terenie.
No, I remember when you came, because we were very excited. We watched your camp being made because it was where we used to live in the summer. And then my father said, today they are coming, and then you must come and meet them when they have settled in their camp. And we came and we see all of you there, and we said, but where have they come from? So Bapu told us that he had said he was adopting you, and that you had come from Poland. And now these are your brothers and sisters. We asked Bapu, okay, Bapu, why are they still living in Balachadi? Why can't they come and live in Jamnagar? So Bapu said, no, they're living in that camp because I have built it, and it is our money, our family's money, which is looking after them. That is why we have adopted them. And we had to do this because the colonial powers didn't want us to receive them. But I said, it is my business who I adopt and who I maintain. So I have to do it on land that is our private land and with our private money. Till they find homes, they are going to be Jamnagaris.
Bapu oprócz stworzenia nam poczucia bezpieczeństwa w tym okresie, jednocześnie dbał o to, abyśmy nie zatracili swojej tożsamości narodowej. W związku z tym, zresztą sam lubił Polskę, znał trochę polską kulturę, nasze obyczaje częściowo, w związku z tym chciał, żebyśmy to zachowali. W związku z tym Mechalania dostarczała nam różnego rodzaju materiały, jakieś inne rzeczy, które wspomagały nam odtworzyć naszą kulturę. Czy pani może pamięta naszych opiekunów, nauczycieli i księdza Plutę?
Father Pluta. Yes, we remember him because he was the adult who used to interact with us. And Colonel Jeffrey Clark, who was in charge of the administration of your camp from my father's side. And then my mother brought in Kathy to look after your health problems. So she used to be the interaction with the doctors who came from Jamnagar, and she was the one who made sure that you got all the right things, the medications and timely things. This is my brother's closet.
Besides shelter and clothing, Jam Sahab took personal interest in developing a healthy body and mind for a future generation of these young Poles.
Kiedy dzieci przyjechały do Balaczadzi, otrzymały posiłek. Maharadża zauważył, że dzieci się trochę krzywiły, bo były zbyt ostre dla nich. I powiedział, nie martwcie się. I później sprowadził 7 kuścików z Goa.
To ja wam teraz opowiem o strajku szpinakowym. Na samym początku, jak przyjechaliśmy, ponieważ szpinak jest bardzo zdrowy, w związku z tym dostawaliśmy co 2 tygodnie, dostawaliśmy ten szpinak. Dzieci się zbuntowały, bo już nie można było jeść tego szpinaku, że starsi chłopcy postanowili zorganizować strajk.
Ja siedziałem akurat tak, że miałem tą dziurę za plecami. Podawali mi koledzy talerze z tym paskudztwem, ja to nabierałem łyżką, nie oglądając się, wyrzucałem za siebie, no i potem dostawałem następny talerz i w ten sposób pozbyliśmy się całej tej potrawy.
There is my class. I stand here. I had about 15 years in this time. It is a school orchestra group, Balachadi, in 1945. I stayed here.
Here.
It is Indian's teacher. Więc w osiedlu nie było pomieszczeń przydatnych do nauki w szkołach. W związku z tym Maharadża udzielił przyznał nam swój guest house dla szkoły przeznaczył. Kiedy już mieliśmy nasze klasy wyposażone w siedzenia, ławki, które dostarczył Maharadża i Maharani, mieliśmy czym pisać, ale nie mieliśmy podręczników żadnych. W związku z tym po pewnym czasie dopiero przybył jakiś jeden podręcznik, pojedyncze egzemplarze i nie było się, dzieci nie miały się z czego uczyć, musiały uczyć się z pamięci, tylko pamięciowo, albo zapisywać. W związku z tym w starszych klasach zaczęto organizować sobie taką samopomoc i żeśmy przepisywali podręczniki i żeby dzieci mogły korzystać z takich podręczników, takich przepisywanych ręcznie.
Oprócz zajęć szkolnych, wychowawczych, ja bardzo lubiłem stworzenia. I między innymi, żeby mieć swoje, to chodziłem po drzewach, wybierałem młode papugi, tak samo młode gołębie, też takie nieloty jeszcze, i z tym, że one już też trzeba było im otwierać i do dzióbka wkładać. Wiewiórki malutkie też się wybierało i karmiło się mlekiem z pipetki takiej do zakraplania oczu. Marzy mi się ta klatka i cieszyłbym się, gdyby ktoś odnalazł i przywiózł mi ją do Polski.
Passion for learning and opportunities were not limited to textbooks, but Jam Sahab created premise for an all-round growth, challenging the limitations of the past.
Takie koryta się wytwarzały w piasku strumienie szerokości 5-10 metrów. I ja tam też ćwiczyłem swoje pływanie i jak pierwszy raz udało mi się przepłynąć taką rzeczkę 10 metrów, to było pierwsze moje zwycięstwo w pływaniu w balaciady.
Otóż brakowało nam sprzętu, więc Maharandża nam dostarczał tam jakieś piłki, urządzenia do siatkówki i koszykówki, do piłki nożnej i tak dalej. A jak potem odbywały się mecze, często oglądał, jak były jakieś wielkie zawody, przyjeżdżały drużyny, zwłaszcza tu jak przyjeżdżała drużyna z Okanewi, tu niedaleko, wojskowa drużyna i rozgrywała z naszym mecz sportowy. Wówczas Maharandża zasiadał sobie w takim głębokim fotelu, no i klaskał i bił nam brawo. A jak żeśmy wygrali ten mecz ostatecznie 2-1, wstał i nam bił brawo, a nie swojej drużynie.
Jak myślicie, co się da z tego zrobić? Piłkę da się zrobić? Możecie spróbować?
Rozpadaj.
Na początku mego pobytu w balaciady myśmy nie mieli żadnej piłki. Myśmy musieli powołać do istnienia jakąś piłkę. Zebraliśmy z całego baraku od wszystkich chłopców skarpetki, których używaliśmy raz w roku, żeby pójść na Wielkanoc.
Mnie najbardziej interesowało harcerstwo, do którego nie mogłem należeć przed wojną, bo byłem bardzo chorowity i przeszedłem wszystkie dziecięce choroby. Dopiero w Balaczadi byłem wystarczająco zdrowy, żeby móc moje marzenie spełnić i nareszcie należeć do harcerstwa.
In sickness and in health, Bapu was the caring father, and so were his medical staff. Fondly remembered were Dr. Amrutlal Ashani and Anant Joshi, the pharmacist.
Oh, I am very glad to see you. Oh, bye, bye.
Can you recognize the face?
Yes, of course. Oh,
Joshi.
Joshi, I know. He's similar to his father.
I wonder that in life of 80 years, there are many incidences happens, but the only deep memory remains with us, and probably that is your memory of Balachari.
Był dla nas takim opiekunem pod względem zdrowotnym. Był tam szpital, którym on był, szefował w tym szpitalu, leczył nas, ale najważniejszą sprawą było, że on był niezwykle serdeczny i miły. To był najbardziej taki przyjazny dla dzieci, małych dzieci, które wymagały, jak były chore, bo jak była epidemia malarii, to on oczywiście zawsze z wszystkimi się opiekował. No i miał zawsze był uśmiechnięty, like you. I am very, very glad to see you. Next one. Oh, no. Bye, bye. I am very proud that
And you can come to Jamnagar anytime, be our guest, and if you want anything, we are here to help you. Because he is like my father, because he has seen him in a young age.
Of course. Don't cry. Oh, just. Oh, my God.
A ja poznałam doktora Oszeniego. Jakby leżałam w szpitalu, miałam atak malarii, a jak był atak malarii, to tak trzęsło. Dosłownie. I on przychodzi w nocy, kilka razy w nocy, sprawdzać, jak się dzieci czują.
Także wszyscy go zapamiętali na pewno do końca życia.
નમસ્તે 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 હવે અમે અહીંયા કણે દુકાન રાખી હતી અને દુકાન કે હું આથી જામુડાથી માલ અહીં પહોંચાડતો અને અમારા બાપુજી બાલાચડી રહેતા બાલાચડી રહેતા અને હું સાયકલથી માલ પહોંચાડતો અને જ્યાં સુધી તમે અહીં હતા ત્યાં સુધી અમારી દુકાન રહી. તમે અહીંથી નીકળી ગયા એટલે અમે દુકાન બંધ કરી દીધી. રૂપાનગરી નામ શા માટે પડ્યું? સુંદર અને રૂપાળા હતા એટલે એનું નામ રૂપાનગરી પાડ્યું હતું. અને બધા બચ્ચાઓ બધા રૂપાળા જ હતા અને એનું નામ રૂપાનગરી પાડ્યું હતું.
Ale najbardziej to ja pamiętam z pałaców, już nie w letnim, tylko przy pałacu w Dżamnagarze, garaże Maharadży. Tam stało chyba kilkadziesiąt samochodów, a najbardziej to mnie i paru kolegów zainteresowały samochody. Tam parę takich samochodów było służące do przewozu kobiet Maharadży. I one się charakteryzowały tym, że z zewnątrz jak się patrzyło, to się widziało tylko własną twarz, a od środka można było wszystko zobaczyć na zewnątrz jak przez normalną szybę. Ja pierwszy raz w życiu tego typu szkło widziałem w ten czas.
And now you are traveling in that same car with me. Makes me very happy to be able to make you sit in this car with me after so many years that father used to come and visit you.
We were all young, me, my cousins, and I think all our Polish friends who attended these Christmas parties. And my uncle, the late Jamsa, was always the central figure.
Some boys and girls were beautifully dressed up, presumably in Polish traditional dress. And they did a dance which was very intriguing, and we even tried to do it.
And you were singing Christmas carols in the middle courtyard. And we came and you were all very, very happy to see Bapu.
And the highlight, frankly, was always the Santa Claus.
I wśród dzieci panował niepokój. Czy przyjedzie święty Mikołaj, ponieważ nie ma śniegu, a sanki po piasku nie mogą jechać. W związku z tym byliśmy zgromadzeni na wielkim placu i oczekiwaliśmy, co będzie dalej.
Suddenly out of the sunset, 3 camels came with huge bags hanging on the saddles and 3 Maggies sitting on top.
And everybody was suddenly stunned and startled. Oh, there is Santa, and where is he coming from? And I assure you that all of us, all our children, we were simply mesmerized.
A mnie w pamięci utkwiły spotkania z Maharadżą w jego pałacu tym letnim. Można było się obwieść ciastkami, owocami do syta. Potem jeszcze można było o ścianę grać w tenisa, co pierwszy raz w życiu robiłem.
Gdy zobaczyliśmy Maharadżę, to dla nas było niesamowite przeżycie. Maharadża to Maharadża.
Czuję się jak we śnie. W tym mieszkaniu byłem prawie 70 lat temu. Później jeszcze kilka razy byłem. Moje pierwsze spotkanie z tym pałacem, byliśmy wtedy małymi dziećmi, było bardzo dziwne, dlatego żeśmy się czuli zagubieni. Oczywiście czuliśmy się tu swobodnie. Dzisiaj czuję się troszkę jakbym był we śnie, jakby czas się zatrzymał, jakby się stało to jakaś przestrzeń nierealna dla mnie.
Good Maharaja Square and schools named after Jam Sahib, built across borders, have kept alive his memories of compassion and large-heartedness with gratitude and reverence in a similar tradition.
To my utworzyliśmy łączność Jana Sacheba z komunizm. Krystyna założyła seminarium dla entuzjastów szkoły, której nie było. To seminarium przez splot okoliczności działo się na terenie Instytutu Orientalistyki i tamtejszy dziekan otoczył nas opieką. Od słowa do słowa. Szkoła powstała, komunizm upadł. Patron dla szkoły sam się prosił, żeby to był wielki Hindus, który uratował polskie dzieci.
Kiedy się żegnał z dziećmi, kiedy go pytano o to, jak się odwdzięczyć, to on powiedział, może kiedyś po latach nazwiecie jakąś szkołę albo ulicę moim imieniem. Pojawił się w naszym programie wychowawczym nowy motyw jeszcze. Skoro Jam Saheb w czasie najgorszej, tragicznej sytuacji Polaków, w czasie II wojny światowej pomagał polskim dzieciom, to co myśmy powinni robić, żeby być godnym tego imienia? No i wtedy zrodziła się właśnie pod wpływem tego taka idea, żeby przyjmować do szkoły dzieci uchodźców, dzieci wykluczone społecznie, więc na przykład dzieci z domu dziecka. Takie dzieci, które wymagają pomocy, tak jak polskie dzieci wymagały pomocy od Jam Saheba.
W tym roku w ramach projektu o naszym dzielnym, wspaniałym Maharadży, naszym patronie szkoły, postanowiliśmy zrobić sztukę indyjskiego twórcy Tagorego, ponieważ jest to spektakl niezwykły, wspaniały.
Mam wrażenie, że wtedy Balaczady było jednym z nielicznych miejsc na świecie, gdzie 365 razy w roku była podnoszona polska bandera przy udziale wszystkich dzieci sierocińca, bo w kraju wtedy było to niemożliwe.
Mój ojciec został zamordowany przez Sowietów. W Indiach Maharadża Jam Saheb stał się dla nas drugim ojcem.
Humanity is just one, and people who divide humanity in castes and religions and nationalities are really ruining the great gift which God has given us, and that is the man's ability to lead a happy life.
Jako historyk zajmujący się przez kilka dziesiątków lat zawodowo historią najnowszą, także głównie II wojny światowej, jestem najgłębiej przekonany, że miał 100% rację Albert Schweitzer, mówiąc, czy nawołując, kiedy mówił, każdy grup wojenny jest w rzeczywistości wołaniem o pokój.
Although the war in Europe had come to an end, Poland still was under a communist regime. While India was close to gaining independence, the Maharajas, including Jam Saheb's social status, was diminished considerably. Since 1943, a new and well-organized Polish colony was already set up in Valivade in India for Polish refugees, where some of Bapu's children also took refuge from 1946 to 1948.
Otóż, będąc w osiedlu w Balaczadzi, no, nie miałem kontaktu z mamą. Dopiero pewnego dnia komendant osiedla wezwał mnie do siebie, do kancelarii i z wielkim podnieceniu oznajmił mi, że przyszło zawiadomienie z Czerwonego Krzyża, że karteczka, że mama poszukuje mnie i że otrzymała przez Czerwony Krzyż informację, że ja żyję i gdzie się znajduję. Ja byłem wtedy tak niezmiernie szczęśliwy. Wybiegłem z tym kartonikiem, którym było oficjalne gdzie było oficjalne zawiadomienie o tym i ten komendant mi to pokazał. Ja byłem wtedy, rozpłakałem się, szczęśliwy byłem, biegałem, poskakiwałem, moja mama żyje, krzyczałem na cały głos, moja mama żyje, brat żyje. I to wtedy było no, niesamowite przeżycie. Pamiętam do dzisiaj tę radość, że jednak mam kogoś na tym świecie. I właśnie w tym dniu byłem tak szczęśliwy, dlatego że odzyskałem swoją część rodziny. Mamę, brata i miałem gdzie wracać już. Nie byłem sam.
Ja byłem zgłoszony do adopcji w USA, bo nie wiedziałem, czy ktoś z mojej rodziny żyje. I wtedy kolega mój starszy dostał list od swojej mamy, która pisała: w Uzbekistanie ostatnio zamieszkałam w jednej lepiance z panią Gutowską i jej córkami. A on sobie przypomniał o mnie, jako o tym dobrym piłkarzu, że mam takie nazwisko i zaprowadził mnie do fotografa i przesłał zdjęcie wraz z listem do swojej mamy, mówiąc, że tu jest chłopiec, który tak się nazywa, może to rodzina. No i się okazało tam po miesiącu, że on dostał list i ja dostałem list. I mama pisze: oj, kochany syneczku, nie wiedziałam, że żyjesz, odnalazłeś się. Ja niedługo będę wracała do Polski.
W 1946 roku sierociniec w Baliczady rozwiązano i pozostałe sieroty przyniesiono do Waliwade. W Waliwade byłem rok czasu. Następnie trafiłem do Anglii w ramach scalania rodzin. Ojciec był w Anglii w korpusie Andersa. Jednocześnie starsi bracia, którzy byli w Afryce, dwóch w południowej RPA, jeden w Ugandzie i w Palestynie w Junakach. W grudniu spotykamy się, z tym, że ja byłem wcześniej w grudniu, a przed samym Bożym Narodzeniem przyjechali bracia z Afryki. 3 ich ubrali w garnitury, kapelusze, bagaże i starszy brat ode mnie o 2 lata, chudy, wysoki, kapelusz mu się zsunął, worek z tymi ciuchami przygniótł go. Jak zobaczyłem, zacząłem się śmiać. A ten zdenerwował się, rzucił worek, podleciał do mnie. Co, ze starszego brata się śmiejesz? Chcesz w mordę? I tak było powitanie braterskie po 6 latach rozstania.
Ale oświadczyłem się jeszcze dużo później, bo dopiero w 2007 na końcu tego roku.
Jurek przyjechał z Bytomia, przyszedł tutaj z kwiatami, uklęknął tutaj w tym fotelu, dał mi pierścionek, no i oświadczył się. A ja przyjąłem oświadczyny.
I gdybym nie wyjechał do Indii, no to prawie na pewno nie spotkałbym Jadwigi.
Czyli dzięki Maharadży spotkaliśmy się i teraz jesteśmy razem.
Smagane wichrem, spalone słońcem, wyniosłe, samotne, trwa. Trwa i czeka. Czeka cierpliwie na swoje dzieci. Bo kiedyś wrócą. Na pewno wrócą.
przez lata uśpione ożyje na nowo i z pamięci cienia na chwilę wróci trudne dzieciństwo i rozłąka, dawne tęsknoty i miłe wspomnienia od dobrej ziemi, co przygarnęła przed laty rozproszone po świecie, zagubione polskie dzieci.
I will always remain faithful and loyal towards Poland and will always sympathize with the future of your country. I am certain that Poland will be independent and you will return to your homes in a country free from oppression. As long as the Polish spirit, which is known to the whole world, will remain the same as it is now, it will win freedom for your country.
The end of Polish children camp Balachady Jamnagar is necessary, but I feel very bad. I was very sad because it was few years my home. Jai Hind!
Yes.
I saw this movie. It's really wonderful. I think everybody should see this. But I heard about this movie from my Indian friends.
Really?
Yes, and he told me about the story because he, in the site where this Maharaja, this compound of the school was there, it is still a school. It's like a kind of a school.
It's called Sainik School now.
Something like this. My friend was attending this school.
Oh, wow.
And they were told this history that Polish children had this refuge over
Yes,
there
yes.
during the Second
For
War.
5 years, 4.5 exactly, because the latter part of that 5th year, because of the war, the Maharaja closed. So it's right here. By the summer, this was his summer residence of the Maharaja. So the village is inward a little bit, but just within walking distance. And they were simple buildings. They didn't even have like windows, but it was so warm they didn't need them. The only thing my mother didn't like, obviously, many of the children were the snakes and scorpions. I mean, it was a different, this was not Soviet Russia. So they had to get quickly accustomed to living in the subcontinent. But the Maharaja was the dearest man. That wasn't popular among the English, obviously, for doing what he did. But he had this wonderful relationship with Poland. And I wanted to say that he had these, as a child, his uncle, Ranji, who was the reigning Maharaja at the time, he was in the British War Cabinet, so whenever they had the meetings at the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, all the world leaders would be there. And the Maharaja, as a young boy, who would accompany his uncle on these expeditions to Switzerland and London, he met Ignacy Paderewski, the Polish president after World War I. And Paderewski, as not only the president, a statesman, but also the pianist, he noticed that the Maharaja had these, the young Maharaja, Jam Sahed, that he had these beautiful, long, slender fingers. And he was like, I think you'll be a great pianist one day because of your beautiful, long, slender fingers. And tradition has it that he gave him, Paderewski gave him one lesson. But after that first lesson, he said to him, I think the elephant stomped on your ear because he was tone deaf, and he had no gift for. But I mean that's just a rumor. But he did. I mean, as far as we know, there were more piano lessons in there. But anyway, so here's a picture of my mom. She's here. This is Juta, and this was a production of Cinderella. In 1944 for the Maharaja. In fact, Pani Janina Dobrostańska, she did dance and theater. She taught the children. My mother was in a lot of these productions, and in the beginning photos, that was my mom too. And here's Maharaja Jam Saheb, Digvijay Singhji, and with his Polish children. And I just wanted to mention that in 1946, Father Franciszek Pluta, the camp's chaplain and commander, he had written letters to the several sovereign countries in hope of securing for his Polish children as well a permanent residence when India was in their fight for independence. With the war over, World War II over, the children, like my mother and siblings, they had no idea of their family's fate back in Russia, were all left behind. And Father Pluta had a brother that lived in Ohio. He embarked on a risky voyage to America in search of a home for his children. And then, let's see, here we go. And in America, there was one Bernardine convent in Reading, Pennsylvania, which offered to take 50 girls with the stipulation that they would, of course, all become religious sisters and nuns. Well, of course, not everybody had a vocation from God to do that, but my aunt did. She was a holier. But my mother didn't, and many of the girls didn't. This is a picture of the 50. My mother's right here. Sister Ella, who became a nun, she is 93 now. This is her here. She still lives in Reading, Pennsylvania, and I visit her every year. And I call them all Chacha. They were all my aunts, because these 50 girls were like sisters throughout their whole lives. This was the last picture actually taken right before, this was in Bombay, right before they embarked on their voyage to America. And in return for the privilege of coming to America, the girls often performed by dancing and singing for Polonia clubs. And they would go by bus from Reading, Pennsylvania to Connecticut, Villa Maria to Chicago. The sisters would just arrange the buses, and this is basically how the girls paid back for their high school education and for the privilege of coming to America. And the nuns were like, you will learn English in 3 months, you know, it's like, you will do this. So they were very grateful because the nuns were so good to them, they really were. And this is my mom, Zhuta. That's not my aunt, that's a friend, Krystyna Zamorska. Years later, let's see if this, oh, how strange. Let me just see what's going on here. Oh boy. Okay, something must have happened when they were switching all the computers, because I had a picture here of the reunions. So, years later, when the girls had their own families, reunions were organized with Father Pluta and some of the male classmates. Many of them, actually, that came with Father Peszkowski. Some went to the Orchard Lake Seminary here in Michigan. And sadly, as I said before, that only a handful of all these children now are alive. As I mentioned earlier, my mother saw herself not as a survivor, but as a thriver. And I'm often asked, how did your mother make peace with such painful memories? What to the average individual might look like defeat, to my mother was an invitation to empower herself and transform her life through 3 decisions: to let go, to forgive, and to dance her way to healing. So the first one, the decision to surrender and let go. And my mother would always say, I can't pretend that this never happened, but I can decide that the people who enslaved us don't get to decide what I do with my memories. This courageous mindset was set by Father Pluta, their chaplain. He would say our wounds deserve a safe haven to be processed, and that place was with God in heaven. The joyful memories you get to keep, but the excruciating ones are yours to release. Father Pluta encouraged the children not to define their lives by the wrong that was done to them, which would only increase their pain, but surrender them to God. Deciding what memories could stay and which to let go of is my mom's transition to step number 2. the decision to forgive. The war impacted every facet of my mother's family life. There was nothing left undamaged. For many, personal tragedy is a time when people become resentful, they become bitter, they turn away from God. But my mother sought to claim victory in her life and to nurture the joy that she had experienced in India. Forgiveness was ultimately her key to transforming her hurt into healing. Forgiveness didn't mean that she ever forgot what happened or excused the crimes perpetrated against her family and her countrymen. And it certainly didn't mean that she was ready to return to Volyn, which was now annexed into the Soviet Union after the war. The whole eastern borderlands were annexed, half of Poland, 52% of the country. Instead, my mother chose not to harbor any ill will toward the Soviet communists, the Bolsheviks, or the Russian people in general. She even chose to show them love, no matter what. And that kind of love takes grace, and she knew she couldn't do that on her own. But with God, all things are possible. And he who forgives prepares for himself peace and grace. My mother made forgiveness a daily practice. And that takes us to my mom, and that's her, the bald child, almost in the front. Their heads were shaved in quarantine many times. So this picture was taken in Quetta in 1942 while they were traveling. Quetta is now in Pakistan, but it used to be in the British colonial India before Indians' independence, where it was again much smaller. In any case, this decision, the third, was to dance herself to healing. In India, the Maharaja and her Polish caretakers did an exceptional job with ensuring that their Polish children had plenty of activities which they hoped could partially alleviate the trauma they experienced in Russia and make pleasant and unforgettable memories. And in this picture, went back to, let me see if I can get it here. And on the right is Pani Dobrostańska, Janina Dobrostańska. She was a very famous pre-war actress from Bydgoszcz, theater actress. This is her here. Her son came with her. She had lost her husband, and my mother looks like the boy there. She is. So they wanted to alleviate the children's trauma, so they did everything that they could to make these great memories for them. My mother soon discovered in India that dancing had given her true joy. My mother is squatting. Let's see if I have another picture. No, but well, she's at the end here in this picture. Again, this is a picture in Quetta as well. Her dance teacher had my mother perform the leading roles, and because of a shortage of the boys, she always had my mom do the boys' part. And she was also really athletic. She could do all the przysiady, przysiadki. So dance was a huge part of my mother's healing. Although later in life, she worked as a registered nurse since 1957, and she had 3 jobs to put food on the table as a single mom. She would go back after work, change late in the evening in the apartment, and then head out to New York City from Queens to the ballroom studios and to the folk dance to dance. She tried her best, and this is my mom at age about 57. So I'm going to be 59. She was like about a year younger, but she looked so fit. She was always dancing. She tried her best to instill her passion of dancing in me and my sister. And I think mostly because my mother believed it to be the cure-all for any malady, any sickness, mental, physical. My mom was always dancing while she cooked, while she cleaned, while she did laundry, while she was working at the hospital. She danced her patients back to health, performing for her patients her beloved Polish dances. Her last dance was the day before she died for my grandson, Anthony, who was 2 at the time. What could have been a future of imminent defeat, my mother chose to see as invitations. Just as a lotus blossom sinks into the mud each evening, but is reborn immaculate the next day, we too can be transformed. We may not be entangled in the throes of war, but we all have challenges, personal challenges that we face. Will we be brave enough to look for those silver linings in our difficulties and awake each morning like the lotus blossom? Zig Ziglar said, "The most difficult roads often lead to the most beautiful destinations." When a generation dies, their stories die with them, unless the younger generations preserve those stories of joy, pain, love, and loss. My mother's story is unique in that it is such a little-known piece of history, especially World War II history. Judith's story is a testament to the roughly 2 million Poles who suffer the same trials but are no longer here to tell them. Sadly, history repeats itself, and only by reflecting on the past can we hope to change the future. Okay, and I've learned through my mother's experience that life can be a graceful combination of both the beautiful and the painful. And I miss my mother so very much, and I just want to thank you for letting me share her story, and thank you for coming.
We have time for questions. I know a lot of people said that they had some comments or questions, so we wanted to make sure that we allowed enough time without going over for the library staff to stay too late. So, who has a question?
Where did you get the title for the book?
Well, without giving it away, because I know some people just bought it and I don't want to give it away, but it would be a reference to, let's just say, Vigilia, the dinner, Christmas Eve night, and we don't start Vigilia till the first star appears in the eastern skies. And this was a theme that when my mother was in Siberia, it's hard for me to tell this story, but they had Vigilia in Siberia, and obviously with nothing, so different from their project that they shared, but they would look for that first star. And the first star, of course, reminds us of Jesus, and Jesus was our hope, was my mother's hope and my hope, and my family's hope, and that's, I think, their faith was a huge part, how they stayed alive. So there's a scene somewhere, I don't know, it's somewhere in the book, I don't want to say where, but it's kind of like, I want to keep up the curiosity to that point. What happens? What is this about the star? But it will be reoccurring in the book, this theme. So yeah, just maybe I could say enough that it's a reference to the Vigilia, that first eastern star in the sky, the Jerusalem, the Bethlehem star. Yes?
Any idea how many Poles were left behind in Siberia when the group with your mother migrated to Iran?
Well, we know this much, that the children that came out, there were about, this is what I heard, okay, from Norman Davis's books, about 100,000 that maybe had survived. So out of the roughly 1.7 million around there, Poles, that in those 4 deportations were taken, many stayed in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, in many of the different republics, where even as far as Kamchatka, I heard that because we have Polish priests that are there now. And so that there are Polish communities, there are Polish schools, like they have, in the Ukraine, that right now, since, let's say 1991, that were functioning, Polish priests went en masse from Poland to become parish priests for these Poles that had not had any of their sacraments too. They just, from word of mouth, had been, and these are hundreds of thousands of them, all over the Soviet Union. Now there were those that returned to Poland as well, those that were stuck in Russia, not the majority obviously, but those that came back. So I mean, out of 1.7 million women and children predominantly, I know of 100,000 that made it out and survived, were taken through Iran, were taken eventually, or the Soviet Union, and came back to Poland. Outside of that, I don't know, out of the 100,000 that I heard, children. Yes.
Well, I was there for 6 years in Siberia, and I came to Poland in 1946. So we stayed there. We didn't came like you mounted.
Yeah.
We just were there.
The other half of my mother's family, some perished in Siberia, but, and we don't have graves for them, but, and other places as well when they were evacuated, but they're near Gdańsk. Because they lost obviously their territories. They don't want to go back there and be in the Soviet Union.
Because I was from Belarus now.
Yes.
From Polesia. Yeah, and so most people were sent to the Russia and they stayed there.
Yeah.
Because Stalin need workers.
Yeah.
He need farmers, and my grandfather was a butcher, so he was sent there because of that.
The only reason my family came back, my grandfather, he joined the Kościuszko army, so they were fighting with the Russians coming back. That was the only chance of getting out of Russia, but the children had to stay in Russia. And then after the war, he couldn't go back and find them. I mean, that's not how it worked. He would never come back to Poland. So there was this Jewish man in actually where Romanówka, it's near today what would be Samara, which was Kubyszew, where there was a Polish embassy at the time. And they were about 200 miles from this Kubyszew in Romanówka. And the oldest sister and the youngest sister, which they're still living in Poland today. And they came back in the late 40s. They have this Jewish man make these papers, he was a lawyer, and make papers to say, I don't know what he said, but he got them out of Russia and back into Poland. And I believe that my older aunt had a fictitious marriage or something that said that, she could leave. She was married to a communist, a Bolshevik, and so she was able to leave Russia. And then, of course, the youngest sister felt like she was being kidnapped because she knew nothing but Russia. So a Russian woman had adopted her, and my older aunt had to literally, in the middle of the night, kind of kidnap her to take her out and back. It's just what Poles went through. Any other, I know questions, yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention that my parents went through Siberia. My father was a Polish officer, was taken prisoner. My mother was working the mines in the gulags. They came down into the Middle East. They met in Iran. My dad took care of the children also. And I had a brother that was born in Lebanon. I was born in London. We went that route. And then we came to the United States.
It's amazing. We're all over. It's a diaspora. We're all over. And when we have these reunions, we have Poles from New Zealand, from Australia, from South America, Peru, Argentina, Curitiba, Brazil. We had Poles from, again, Europe. But even those that stayed with the army in Italy, which is interesting, a lot stayed in Italy as well, and other, Scotland. But that was, and in Mexico. There were more than 3,000 Poles. So in Santa Rosa, there's a community near La Ciudad de Mexico, the Santa Rosa community. They were huge. So, I mean, we're just like gypsies, My mother considered herself always a gypsy. Yes.
How many stayed in Iran?
In Iran, actually, I don't know what it was, how many stayed, but I do know that women predominantly, married Iranian men. And I know from, because I wanted to go to Iran, and then the pandemic hit, and because I wanted to go to this Dubai cemetery, some of the sisters in Reading, Pennsylvania, there are only 3 that are still alive out of all these girls, and I see them every year. And one of the sisters, I promised that I would visit her father's grave there in Tehran. It didn't happen, but she would say, like, a lot of the girls married because the Persians were, the Polish women were beautiful, first of all, and the Iranian men just loved them, and they made a great match. I mean, there were stores, they worked, and this one woman, I forgot her name, but she was still alive only 10 years ago, still living in Tehran. And all I remember is that there was an article with her, she had a parrot, and she was saying that she doesn't keep her parrot in the cage because the parrot has to be free. because what she endured. And, yeah, she went through all the, the Ayatollah and, in 1979 when the Shah was taken out of Iran. So, but she said for Poles, it's still very safe, and Persian-Polish relationships are very strong. So, yeah.
In the book, I have not read the book yet, I look forward to reading it, but do you talk about her parents, your grandparents? To them?
Yes, it's all about that story, all throughout World War II. It's in a novel form.
Okay.
Yeah. There are a lot of biographies, a lot of memoirs, and this is more in a novel form, so it's engaging, and I think we get more invested in people's lives. Yes?
People have asked about survivors. He's not going to let me, he's going to be upset with me. Chester was one of the people, he was 4 years old. So we've got one of the survivors.
Dylan, does Chester say something?
Would you like to come up and say something?
No.
He's shy. Many of us do not know the story. Many of us.
I think we've got a couple of minutes here, but the story that Imogene told today, the story that she tells in the book, is one of tens of thousands, millions of stories about World War II. It was called a World War for a reason, because it raged literally around the world. Some of the maps that Imogene showed here that showed Europe, the Soviet Union, or what some of us prefer to call Russia today, for some other reasons I won't get into. The Middle East, I mean, that gives you an idea of how huge the area was that this story and stories like this encompass, and that doesn't even cover Asia, China, Japan, the Pacific and all that, so it's a huge, huge story. Those of you that are history buffs, like I am, may be familiar with it, much of that story, but even if you are, the story that Imogene tells today is still relatively little known. Much of it was suppressed, if you will, during the communist era, during the Cold War, from after World War II until essentially 1990. So some of these stories didn't even begin to emerge until that time. The Cotton Massacre that Imogene referenced earlier in her presentation is one example. And Poles weren't the only ones. I mean, many of us here are Polish for obvious reasons, we're Polish Americans, but other nationalities went through similar experiences, sometimes in a larger scale, even numerically. I mean, think of some of the things that happened in China and so on. But this story is unique in many ways, and the story of the children, thousands of children. And there's not too many stories that I'm aware of during World War II that correspond to the story that Imogene is telling here. So I would just suggest those of you that are interested, pursue this, buy her book if you can. But even if you don't, the information's out there. But if you have a few key words to look for, Polish children, Siberia, some of those key words, those of you that are adept with the internet, it's not difficult to find these stories. And I would encourage you to study up on them, because they're really fascinating stories, they're tragic stories, and they're stories that still are not very well known.
Yeah.
Imogene, in later years, did your mother have, given the incredible hospitality that the Polish survivors experienced in countries around the world, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and so many other places, did your mother have a view about the continued genocide happening around the world and how we as human beings should respond to that? Or did she sort of put that out of her thinking?
Well, this is important to say that my mother, when they were invited to India first, they weren't I have to mention this because a lot of times people say, we shouldn't have borders, and it's right because of your mom. My mother, and this is what my mother would have said. My mother said we were invited. The Maharaja invited us. We didn't force ourselves. We would have stayed in, or we probably wouldn't have been forcing that situation. So that's number one. My mother believed that the world community should always work together to welcome anybody, okay? Anybody who is a refugee is, because we believe as Catholics they're a child of God and that we have to welcome them. And that was my mother's philosophy. But my mother did make, I remember a couple of times, like, reporters would ask her, you know, what is this about these borders and everything? And it was some situation years ago, somebody was interviewing her, and she just said, well, but she said, I was invited, because somebody said the word, I forget if it was just refugee or something that bothered her, and she said, but we were invited, we were the Maharaja's children, you know, she was like, and she didn't have an answer for that, thinking from my mother's brain. But knowing who my mother was, we always had somebody in our house from another country, you know, like any country. I mean, my mother was very an international person in that sense, to believe in the goodness and brotherhood of man. So as the Maharaja did, you know, that's what he instilled in the children. And all of these children that I know that grew up had that same mentality. We are brothers, you know, so anybody that would be stranded or, you know, that we would welcome them.
And thank God there were people like him, because after what the children in Siberia experienced.
Well, the rich countries, the free world at the time didn't respond to Sikorsky, General Sikorsky, the Prime Minister in London. He had sent to all the world leaders many letters requesting help for these children in Siberia. And they fell on deaf ears. The first two countries to respond were Mexico and India, but India was the first.
Real quickly, my mother is a survivor also from a Siberian labor camp, and she tells the story of living in, she ended up in England, where she met my father, another survivor. And they tell the story of when World War II ended, there was this huge celebration throughout England, throughout London. And the Poles wanted to march in the celebration. But they were prevented by the British and by the Americans, who did not want to offend Stalin.
Exactly.
So the Poles were told to step aside and not be part of that celebration.
And the pilots decided to side with their brothers, and they didn't march. Because the pilots, they said, okay, because of the Squadron 303 and all that, but no, the pilots said, we're going to be in solidarity with our other armed force brothers. Yeah, that was just to think that the Poles are the only army in the whole world to fight on both fronts, the East and the West. There's no other army. They were prevented from marching, and that was at the Victory Day parade.
That's right.
This was just such an abomination. And that's why we have to tell these stories, because Poles, I mean, if you go to Poland, the average Pole speaks, the average, to me at least growing up, I mean, I went there every year, my father worked for Pan Am, so that was easy. But anyway, when they opened, like in 1970, you know, they opened Moscow and this. So we'd go to Poland and Zagierka, so during Gieryk's reign. And I just remember growing up, like in America, nobody spoke many languages, but Polish people, the young girls at like 10, they were sewing, they were fixing cars, they were doing everything. And I'm thinking, Polak potrafi, you know, Pole can. And with nothing. So this is something we have so much to be proud of. And here in America, in the 70s, at school, I had Polish jokes. That's all. Not until John Paul II came. I remember growing up with Polish jokes and that I was stupid. And I kind of bought into that too. You know, like, I guess maybe I am. You know, I don't know. How do I tie my shoe? What? You know, there were all these, how do I change a light bulb? And I don't know. But anyway, it wasn't until maybe later when I was a teenager and I really fully understood when actually my mother became her patient was a Shavira in 1979. I was 15, and I distinctly remember when my mother started telling me this story, because that was really the time when she started telling me what really happened. Because she came home one day and she's like, you just won't believe who my patient is, you know, and she wasn't really supposed to tell me either. But this intrigued me, and I'm like, wow. Iran, Afghanistan, India, this story, like, because living in New York City, we only had Jewish neighbors, so we only knew about the Jewish Holocaust. Nobody talked about the Polish Holocaust, on both sides, under the Germans and the Russians. So I don't think there was any nation that could come close. 20% of our population was decimated in World War II. The country was ruined, the infrastructure, everything. There was no other nation that survived, and brick by brick rebuilt Warsaw. Brick by brick, the cities that were destroyed, built with their own hands. We had no Marshall Plan, no help from the West. So, I mean, the nation was rebuilt. This is so remarkable, and so we should pat ourselves on the back. If you have Polish ancestry, we have so much to be proud of.
We have time for one more question. Anyone or comment?
May I just say, I'm reading the book, and it is captivating. It is a very good read. I urge you to do that. And I have to compliment you. Despite the technical difficulties.
Oh, I know. We came early 2 hours.
You did a great job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for your help.
I would just like to say, there's so many of us that really never heard the story. I never did. And I overheard Chester talking about it one day in a group, and I was so curious. And the first opportunity I got, I gave him a call and invited him to the Institute to come and talk to me one-on-one and tell me this wonderful story, and Zosha's story, and Pat Bargowski's story. So my message to everyone here tonight is, find these people, ask them to meet you in the park and sit on a park bench and listen to the story, because it really is life-changing, the way we think and the way we feel and what we know and what we don't know. So I really recommend and have your children and your grandchildren hear these stories, because they're just amazing. And so I thank Imogene for, it was easy to invite her, because it's so interesting, and there's so many ways to tell the story and to hear about it. But one of them is have somebody sit down with you and talk about either their experience or their experience with their family. So I'd like to just bring up Mabasha Tulecki for a minute.
Yes, thank you again so much, Imogene. We have a small gift from the Institute. And we hope you enjoy it. And before we let everybody leave tonight, I just also wanted to remind that the Piast Institute is celebrating its 20th anniversary, and we would like any comments. We would love for you to visit our website, piastinstitute.org, and find out more. We will be having another lecture in May, scheduled for the 18th, and it will be with Dr. Dominic Statua, and about Polish Americans Today. It is about a book that was published by the Piast Institute, and it is a comprehensive study about Polish Americans. He will be also doing additional data outside of the book that was done from a national study in 2020, and it is one of the most recent and updated information that we have about Polish Americans living in the United States as of now. And that study was done by the Piast Institute. So please enjoy yourselves, help yourselves to some additional food in the back. And again, thank you so much for coming out tonight and for being here with us. First of all, you know what?